Yes, indeed.
Wonderful. Well, it's good to see you. Good morning. We'll give it a couple of minutes. I don't know if your students are a minute or two late to class, but our parishioners are absolutely a couple of minutes late to forums like this. So we'll give it a minute.
Yeah, arriving late to class on Zoom is a different kind of thing than arriving late to class through a doorway. So I've
Yes.
learned to adjust
Yes.
to
Yes.
virtual teaching.
Yes. And of course, being late to Zoom church is even less noticeable, than in-person church. So I'm certain that we have a little bit of that. Let's see. I'll introduce you in just a moment, Woody. But it's a beautiful day here in Denver. Blue skies. I think we'll be about early 60s in terms of temperature. It's just gorgeous. What's the weather like there in Swanee, Tennessee?
Equally gorgeous. It's like the perfect September day in November.
Yeah. Oh my goodness, that is a perfect, just perfect. And I know that you, as you and I've talked about, I know that Swanee in the southeast really had a mild summer compared to normal summers. It seems like I hear from my family that it was a little cooler compared to previous summers.
Well, it may have been cooler, but it was probably the most humid 2.5 months of my life. So there was let's say mildew was a more prominent theme in my life than I've been accustomed to.
Oh my goodness. Well, it looks like it's 9:02, so we will begin. Good morning. My name is Richard Lawson. I'm the Dean of St. John's Cathedral here in Denver, and we are delighted to have as our guest in this morning's Dean's Forum Dr. Woody Register, who is a professor of history at Swanee, the University of the South, and also the director of the Roberson Project, which we will talk about shortly. Welcome, everyone. Welcome, Dr. Register. And before we begin, I will offer a brief prayer from the Book of Common Prayer. And Woody, we've been praying prayers for an election, prayers for times of conflict, things like this, and all of those prayers in some ways, especially times of conflict, still apply. But I think with a little bit of a shift in the presidential election tally, that we can begin shifting our prayers a bit as well. So I'm going to offer a prayer from the prayer book for cities, and I will certainly add towns, knowing that you are in Swanee, a small town, and thinking about the towns and countrysides throughout this country today. But it's a beautiful prayer for cities that really sums up what many of us are longing for as this election comes to a close. So let us pray. O God, our Creator, in your word you have given us a vision of that holy city to which the nations of the world bring their glory. Behold and visit, we pray, the cities and towns of the earth. Renew the ties of mutual regard which form our civic life. Send us honest and able leaders. Enable us to eliminate poverty, prejudice, and oppression, that peace may prevail with righteousness and justice with order, and that women, men, and children from different cultures and with differing talents may find with one another the fulfillment of their humanity through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Good morning, Woody.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
It's a pleasure to have you. And as you and I talked about this week, I'm going to, for our introduction, I would like to personalize it a little bit. We could talk a lot about your books, your profession, and your PhD from Brown, all kinds of things like that. But instead, I would like to start just by saying just a brief word about where I'm from and where you're from. I think people will be interested in that, especially as we move into the topics of the election and race in the Episcopal Church more in general. I'm born and raised up in North Alabama, a little town called Guntersville on the Tennessee River. And Guntersville then and now is a racially diverse town. And for me, it was growing up in that town where I first became very curious about the subject of race, intellectually and spiritually curious, because I went to a public school, played sports, and as I experienced school and sports, and especially the Gunnersville Public Recreation Center and the swimming pool, all of which I loved and where I spent more time than I did in my own home, I experienced race one way personally through all of that. And it was in conflict as I got older. I realized it was in conflict with some of the stories and myths that I was told by my own family about the origins of race and the status of race in our culture. You grew up in LA, which is not Los Angeles. Do you mind sharing where you grew up and your first experiences of race?
Yeah, I'm from Lower Alabama, which you kindly abbreviated as LA. I'm from a little town, Evergreen, Alabama, which when I was growing up, so it's south of Montgomery, about halfway between Montgomery and Mobile. So it's very South Alabama, and that makes a difference in Alabama.
Sure.
And when I was growing up, there were probably 5,000 people in my little town. Today, it's edging towards 3,000. So it is an area of that has declined in population, declined in wealth. It was a thriving little town when I was young. It's hard to describe it that way now. But it's where I learned race. It's where I learned how to be white. It's where I learned what it meant to be white and what it meant to be Black. So that is the seat of my upbringing.
Well, and that's where you launched an incredible intellectual journey. So with that, let's dive in. You're an American historian, and tell us from your viewpoint, where does this election, let's talk in general terms, and especially the presidential election, where do things stand as of this Sunday morning, November the 8th?
Yeah. Yes, I had a friend who sent me a text early this morning. How you feeling? He asked me. And I said, well, today it's back to reality. You know, however you felt about the elections, evolution over the last 4 days and the announcement of the outcome yesterday, I think today we're back to the question of, what is this going to mean? We woke up essentially the same people we were a week ago with the same problems, the same challenges. So I think there are way more questions, however relieved, elated, or defeated you feel by what happened this week. I mean, the things that I think we can count on. One, I think that people keep talking about the current occupant of the White House being ushered out the door. But I think Donald Trump is probably the world's leading celebrity now. He has a voice. He has an audience unequaled, to my knowledge, by anyone else on the planet, on this planet, and that isn't going away. That's probably his greatest source of wealth now, above and beyond any of the properties that are in his portfolio. And I don't see him wishing to see the value of that diminish. So I think that the disputes, the arguments, the points of conflict are, we just might as well settle in and accept that we will be addressing these. And I hope, to whatever degree we can, civilly talking about them over the next foreseeable future.
What do you make? I've watched enough to know that the last couple of days, and certainly President-elect Biden, both before this election and certainly in the last couple of days, is talking about how he is ready for exactly the dynamic you're talking about. Not President Trump's platform, but the division in this country. Do you think, how hopeful are you for, President-elect Biden used the word healing, which is a religious word. how hopeful are you for healing, for yeah, how prepared do you think that we are to move into a new season, in light of what we've seen in terms of how many votes President Trump received and how many votes President-elect Biden received? It's so close.
Yeah, I, I mean, we all participate in politics as an act, I think, as an act of hope, an act of belief that the future can be some version of what we wish it to be compared to what it is, the world is in the present. So I voted hopefully. I didn't just vote negatively, that is against something. I voted for something. And I believe that the people who won on Tuesday in the national sense and the people who lost on Tuesday in the national sense had that at least in common. Now that may be more faith on my part than realism, but I still believe that. I believe that there, in American politics, in American life, we agree on far more than we disagree about. And that the arguments are, in a sense, over something we share and how we believe the nation is moving or existing at that moment in relation to these shared areas of concern, shared values. So there's a lot that we have, we have to work with that would make a person hopeful. That said, changing the occupant of the White House really, I don't think it matters that much. The work that has to go on at the micro level, at the community level, at the individual level. There's work for me to do. There's certainly work for you and your parishioners to do. And the extent to which we all take up that shared task, that shared responsibility, I think therein lies where we can really help, the degree to which we do that. But if we're going to say, oh, now we don't have to watch the news, we don't have to worry about politics every day, we can go back to being what we were once upon a time, that's an abdication of authority that will have ill consequences, I think, that won't create a common ground, a shared ground for addressing problems. And I think that would not make me hopeful.
Well said. What, Woody, are the messages and implications of this election in terms of race?
Yeah, I think I was of a different mind on Wednesday when we talked than I am today. My thought on Wednesday, the day after, reflecting my state of mind when I gave up on my pledge to stay up late on Tuesday night and just went to bed, and then woke up the next morning not expecting even the sun to be shining, although it was. I was thinking that the outcome of this race was going to be read as a ratification of the very tendencies and the very strong feelings about race in America that I would like to see addressed and, in your words, healed. So that had me concerned. I was thinking, as I went to bed on Tuesday night, and then we talked on, I guess, Wednesday morning, that I was going to be spending more of my time having to make arguments that I haven't been spending so much of my time the last 3 years addressing. I thought that the outcome of the election was going to be a ratification. So I feel less that way now. I feel like we're, at least on race, that not much has changed, and that again it will be up to all of us to make things change. I don't think that Biden can talk about healing all he wishes. The work of healing, and we'll talk about this later, the work of healing is hard work, and that hasn't changed at all. So as I said, back to reality today.
So put a little finer point on it, if you will, Woody. And I'm going to try to help you do that. I understand what you just said, but I want to see if we can hone in and be a little more specific. A lot of people, including a good number of Episcopalians, would have been so aware of race being really central to this election. And a lot of people believe that, there was a lot of race baiting on the side of President Trump. And to give what is perhaps one example of that I'm sure was that you noticed as a historian, was President Trump saying that he really doesn't know much about Congressman John Lewis's life. And when you've got statements like that, perhaps policies, put that in context for us, because that was very, very hard. And I think that transcends politics, Republican or Democrat. How do you contextualize the subject of Trump and race for us?
Well, I guess my greatest concern on Tuesday night and Wednesday was that the Trump brand of race baiting was going to be ratified as an effective strategy for winning elections in this country. And I don't think that is the outcome.
Okay. Thank you for being specific on that. Now I follow you. Got it.
I mean, so when we began our project here at Sewanee, it was in the official beginning date was July of 2017. So that's about a month before the demonstrations at Charlottesville. So we didn't start our project in relation to Charlotte or in response to Charlottesville, but Charlottesville had a dramatic impact upon our project and upon how we pursued it from that time forward. But one of the things that I think that Charlottesville did was that it changed how people who would have been very critical of the work we are doing, I think it changed how they saw the work we are doing. Not everyone by any means, but I think it did awaken people to the toxicity of these, or potential toxicity of these disputes and arguments about public symbols and public memorials, and how they reflected, a continuation of the history of race and racist injustice in this country. So I think, I had this sense that it actually made our job, if not easier, more effective. And my concern was that the race on Tuesday was going to pull that rug out from under us and ratify a kind of a different racial attitude, or at least ratify the use of these kinds of racist strategies for winning an election. I'm not convinced that helped. I don't think it's going away, but I think it's a status quo on that. We still have a lot of work to do, and it's difficult work, but I don't think that that Trump's strategy worked. I think, for me, I look at the election, it was a kind of referendum on Trump and Trumpism, and I don't think that won. I think that that lost in a way that seems more decisive today than it did 3 days ago. But the appeal of these arguments, the way in which they could bring dividends to those seeking political power, that hasn't gone away, and certainly President Trump will not be going away anytime soon.
Well, I'll just say very quickly, and then I do want to shift and learn more about your work with the Roberson Project. But my hope and dream for the subject of race, I know that race is absolutely tied in some ways to policy. Criminal justice reform comes to mind. But I also believe that race is a subject that people of all goodwill across the entire political spectrum should care deeply about. And my hope and dream is that we can as a country begin to see race as a subject that includes politics and at the same time transcends it. And the reason why is because it's about humanity. The prayer that we opened with spoke of God uniting peoples of different cultures and races and cities and towns throughout the world. And it's that common humanity, which is a divine gift, I believe, and that transcends, it relates to politics, but it also transcends ideology because it's about humanity. So that's my hope. Tell us, Woody, a bit more about the Roberson Project and Sewanee. And I really wish we could I want to get to your idea that you mentioned on the phone last week, about storytelling. You as a historian believe that storytelling is an art we need to recover, and especially when we think about stories related to race. And very often, those stories bear a lot of pain and a lot of tragedy. And there are some people in our culture, and as you and I both know, a lot of white folks don't sort of try to shy away from stories that are about our painful history of white supremacy, because they feel like that will just be confined to that story. You have a different take on that, that painful stories and storytelling in general are the first step, as you said this past week, the first step toward loving ourselves and loving these institutions that we serve, whether country or church or universities.
Yeah, telling what I call more truthful stories about our institution is critical to our project. But equally critical is an openness among the people like myself who are doing this work to listen, to hear different stories we've not heard before, either because we've been unwilling or because the people who can tell them have never been given a forum in which they could tell them with the confidence that they would be heard. And these stories tarnish. I'm not even sure if tarnish is a strong enough word. They undermine a confidence we have about the essential goodness of the community in which we live, and people have lived here and attended this university for many generations. We have something here that my wife is now a retired professor of history here, that we call Sewanee exceptionalism. This is the idea that the rest of the world may be one way, but Sewanee is the exception. And this is very powerful throughout the 20th century, right? The rest of the South may be at war over race, unable to find a condition of harmony and mutual regard and respect and love. But we have that at Sewanee. Now, that is one of the stories that white people at Sewanee have been telling with a kind of sinful pride, let us say, for many generations. And it is much more complicated than that, especially if you talk to or listen to the voices of African American people. We had this experience early on, or I did at least, when I got involved with a project several years ago, working on one of the storied elements of Sewanee's history. And I spent about 5 months in our archive. And during that time, I discovered that which shouldn't have come as a surprise to me, that we have a kind of Jim Crow archive. We have an exceptional archive at Sewanee, a rich, dense collection telling the history of this university, but it is lily white. You would not know that Black people lived here. You would not know that Black people worked here and contributed vital labor and energy to the success of this institution. Certainly, they were not students, but they have been here from the first. But you would not know that unless you come across a story in which Black people figure and make white people look good. So one of our first projects, one of our first focus areas of focus was to bring back or bring the experience of African Americans and their contributions to this place into the center of Sewanee story, rather than leaving it on the in the distant periphery. And this applies to the African Americans who were enslaved by those men who founded this university in the 1850s, as well as to the African Americans who lived and shaped this community for many generations in the 20th century.
And for our viewers who might not be aware, Sewanee is where I am a graduate and where you are an undergraduate. Katie Pearson went to our canon on staff, went there, as well as our youth minister and our director of communications. It's a place near and dear to our hearts in many, many ways, and has shaped and formed us. Sewanee is an Episcopal college, and some of those slaveholders whom you're mentioning, one of whom I'm very aware was an Episcopal bishop. So it's what you're naming is intertwined with Episcopal history, at least in the Southeast.
Yeah, well, it's the history of the Episcopal Church in general. It's not just the Southern Episcopal Church, and I think this is something that everyone needs to realize, that you can't cordon off the South in the period before the Civil War, and you can't cordon off the South in the period after the Civil War either. And I think this is something that Episcopalians today are increasingly aware of and are increasingly determined to do something about. But yes, everyone says it's no surprise that Sewanee's founders were slave owners, right? They were prominent men in the South in the 1850s. Of course they would be. That's no news. There's nothing, tell us something we don't know. But what you don't know, making that admission allows you to push the fact that they were slave owners to the edges of what mattered at the time. And what we're arguing is it's actually at the center. That the University of the South was not founded, for the kind of religious purposes, to train a ministry, to train the sons of of Episcopalians in the South. You can't just say that without saying that slavery was really at the center of all of this. The University of the South was founded by men who were determined to create an institution that would not just defend slavery, but perpetuate it. They ascribed to a pro-slavery Christianity. They believed that they were doing God's work, God's appointed work, by enslaving people. And that those who were critical of that, they were the infidels, they were the sinners, they were the ones who were contrary to God's law. And this is what we've been trying to do, is to not just to recover their worldview at the time and the centrality of slavery to that worldview, but also to ask how that history and its legacies for generations afterward affect us today. Call on us today to ask what, with this history that we have, we need to do today. And that's why we are not just about history, our project. We're also about working towards reconciliation, working towards healing.
I want to keep going on that, but before I do, let me add, please, just a couple of points. One, for everyone who's listening and participating, if you have a question or comment for Dr. Register or for me, please, if you go down to the navigation bar at the bottom of your screen, click Q&A, question or comment, and we will be sure to get to it. Woody, I heard Brian Stevenson, who's the remarkable lawyer and author in Montgomery, Alabama, and another Alabamian, African-American, he's, just for our viewers, Just Mercy is his book. You may have seen the recent movie that's outstanding about his life. And I've heard him say before that if we don't tell these stories about our true history at these institutions and even in our country, if we don't tell these stories, and he would say memorialize places of the slave trade, putting up plaques, literally memorializing the history and becoming aware of it and telling these stories in all kinds of symbolic ways. If we don't do it, he said, and I was so curious by the phrase he used, and he said it off the cuff, we will be haunted by these ghosts. We'll continue to be haunted by these ghosts for the rest of our lives. And I thought about when he said it, the notion of being haunted by a ghost, or even the demonic, not as a literal demon, but as something that just will tear us apart if we don't finally look it in the eye. What's your response to that? Do you see history and storytelling as a kind of religious exercise in that way?
I do see it as I do believe in those kinds of ghosts, by the way. And I think that having grown up in South Alabama, and I'll just say, I meant to mention this earlier, that Just Mercy is essentially about my hometown. Monroe County, where it takes place, is the neighboring county. The district attorney, who figures so importantly in that book, I grew up with his brother. My mother worked for his father. My grandmother worked for his father. It is the story. I know these people. I knew these people. In that book, I have felt Just Mercy is not just an indictment of that world. It's an indictment of me too. That book struck me hard, and I am haunted by it. I am haunted by the way in which my parents shielded me from the worst. I didn't grow up in a civil rights crusading family by any means. I grew up in a loving family. I'm blessed to have had. And I had a kind of a good childhood, but my parents shielded me from this. They didn't. They didn't question the world with me, and I think that has haunted me ever since. That has shaped me ever since. It means that I am, like most people, still learning today. I am still unlearning race, as they say, but I'm also still learning from other people. As recently as last week, I felt I got a good schooling in something that I didn't fully understand. So the world that I live in today and that I teach in, and that I love very much, and not just as a graduate, I've been at Sewanee for 28 years teaching. This is my adult life. This is the place where I have given most of what I have. Is where I've raised a family. It is my home. But it is a place that is that has inherited and perpetuates a distorted sense of itself, of its exceptionalism. And if we don't tell these stories, if I don't do something to recover the history that we have, that White Sewanee has deliberately suppressed and would wish not to reappear in the record, then we will continue to be haunted and fragmented and incomplete. We'll continue to be I want to say a kind of dishonest version of ourselves. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that any love that's based on dishonesty is a good love. I don't think it's a true love. And as much as we love this place, if it means that we have to be blind to its history, if it means we have to admit some stories but omit others, then that's not the kind of love that we want for this institution or this town.
You are not an Episcopalian. However, you know us quite well by undergrad through today, your work at Sewanee. But you've been deeply affected and inspired by a number of African American Episcopalians. Do you mind giving us a couple of examples of that?
No, not at all. In fact, I would like to. I began this project, as you say, a non-Episcopalian, but also as an academic. And I thought of it as academic at its core, as something that was basically secular. I've changed my mind since then. And that's been because of the example, because of the witness, because of the wisdom that I have been exposed to. The first person to mention is the person for whom this project is named, Houston Roberson. Houston, African-American, the first African-American to get tenure at Sewanee, the first person to teach African-American history as his full-time occupation here at Sewanee, was among my dearest and most beloved friends, and my wife as well. He died in December 2016, and he and I were the same age. And he grew up in Southwestern Virginia. I grew up in South Alabama. We had a lot in common, a lot to talk about. But Houston was a devoted, a devout, even though he'd grown up in the Baptist church tradition in Southwestern Virginia, he was an Episcopalian. And he helped me see, I think, he changed how I viewed the Episcopal Church, which, when we started here, the church, at least the kind that we were exposed to here at Sewanee, tended to be a little more reactionary and conservative. And he's still fighting over ordaining women here, in this county when I started here in the 1990s. The other people who have affected me, one I mentioned the other day is Catherine Meeks, who came here to speak in the spring of the first year of this project. I will confess, I knew almost nothing about Catherine Meeks when she came here. So I give all of the credit to bringing her to Sewanee to my colleagues at the School of Theology. And when Catherine sat down and said that she was going to read from her most recent book, I kind of, inside I was saying, oh, okay, we're going to read from a book. But let me tell you, when she read from that book, I was stunned and moved so deeply by her story. And the story that she told was about the death of her brother, which is really the racist murder, a kind of virtual lynching of her brother in front of her father. And she's telling this story, and yet telling it as part of her story of faith, of something that I cannot be confident that if this happened in my life, that I would not have lived and still be living today a life of hatred and anger and fury, but not her. Catherine reminded us in that talk, she kind of poked, I would say she poked fun at me because of the use of the word reconciliation. And she effectively said that it's easy for white people to talk about reconciliation because they think that they can do a little work and then everything will be okay. And then you just move along and life is better. But that story she told, which is a story about reconciliation, that was well beyond anything that I had fathomed in this regard. And she has been ever since a profound influence on how I think about the work of racial healing and the difficulty of it and the amount of pain on my part it will take, pain on people like me, to make healing really possible. I think the last example, if I may, one more.
I would love for you to give one more. If I may just say just a couple quick things about Dr. Meeks, because Dr. Meeks will be our guest here in the Dean's Forum in the spring. So we're excited to have her. She's a professor. She's the Episcopalian. And the director of, I believe it's called, I don't have the title in front of me, Woody, but I believe it's actually is the Absalom Jones Center. And Absalom Jones is an African-American saint, if you will, in the Episcopal Church. Center for Racial Healing. I think that might be, I know it, she does not use the term reconciliation. I think it is racial healing.
Deliberately.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes. Go ahead.
Well, no, that is, yes. She says, healing is what needs to be done, and the healing is in both directions. So she says that we have all sustained lasting and injuries from racism, although they're not the same kinds of injuries, I think she would say. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think she's an incredibly powerful voice that must be heard.
Agreed.
The only other example I was going to use very quickly was one from this past February, or before the coronavirus, when we had our winter semester convocation. And the Bishop of West Tennessee, Phoebe Roaf, came to speak and said words in All Saints Chapel, which, if you know anything about Sewanee, All Saints Chapel is the spiritual center of the campus, a beautiful setting. And Bishop Roaf talked about racism. She talked about slavery and Sewanee's history to slavery in a way that no one ever had before. I've never had that opportunity to say it in the chapel, and she did. So that in itself was history making. But there was one thing that she said that had never occurred to me, and I think it's something what she said was that she reminded us that God, in the mid-19th century, that God loved not just the enslaved, God also loved Leonidas Polk, one of the founding bishops, a man who enslaved hundreds of people over the course of his life, the Bishop of Louisiana. And this had never occurred to me, right? That that I needed to think about that within the Christian tradition, God loves all sinners, all people. But that this was an important message for us, that that we can love our university, even with its many levels of imperfection. That we can love these, we can approach these people in the past who represented what we would today regard as evils, but do it in a spirit not just to hate them or to condemn them, but to do it with a kind of humility and understanding, and that this is a pathway for institutional healing, I think. It means, though, that you can take up the most difficult situations. And Episcopal churches all across the South and even outside the South have these kinds of challenges, the memorials that they have within their church structures or in their cemeteries or graveyards, that you can take these up in a spirit of love and in a spirit of healing that doesn't mean just directing a kind of venomous hatred towards the past, which is not the way to bring about healing in the present and the future.
Really, really well said. Thank you for that. And as we begin to finish our time, one of the things that you have made me think about is we do this work of storytelling and of honesty, and sometimes very difficult honesty for some of us, especially white people, because we're trying to be truthful to our history. But I think what you're also adding into the mix is this bit about a hope for healing. And I'll say, and this is the preacher's take on it, a theological take on it. The promises in Scripture are that racial diversity is a divine gift. And when the Scriptures begin to imagine heaven, and some of the images are a little more specific than others. Some of them appear a little too literal versus others. But when they do, the best of those images all revolve around heaven being this place of unimaginable diversity, and yet of unimaginable healing. A place in which difference of all kinds is an absolute gift and never a deficit. And therefore, heaven is a place of just unimaginable peace. And all of it inspired by the divine, which is just below the surface of all of those differences. So I like to think that good history and storytelling, even when it's painful for some of us, is preparing us not just to be hopeful for Earth, but hopeful even for what's on the other side of this grand mystery. And that leads just to our last question. And you've answered it implicitly, but I would love to hear you just say a few words about it as we close. You're a historian who's often looking back, but you certainly appear to me to be a hopeful historian. Would you say just a little bit about perhaps that paradox of your work?
Well, I often say I go to bed a pessimist and I wake up an optimist. So when you're losing hope, just go to bed, and maybe things will look better in the morning. I mean, there are two ways I see this as a historian. In the most sort of basic way, you define a historian as someone who doesn't study the past. You study change over time in the past. History is a record of change, good change, bad change, perhaps. But even our understanding or our evaluation of change is determined by the time in which we live. What would constitute progress to me today would not have constituted progress to most people or some people in the past. But it is a record of change, and that whatever is now will not be in the future. So we don't have to believe that things are locked in. And it's this capacity for the world to change that gives me some reason to hope that it isn't locked in. But of course, many people have been worried over the last however long that the world is changing in a way that we don't want it to go. So, and likewise, related to this, I believe that people's actions do matter, that they do affect history, and for good or bad, or for a mixture of the two. So I do think that our actions make a difference, and the local level as well as in a larger level. And then, go ahead.
No, please.
The other thing I'd say in particular about racism is that I think most of what we know and what we believe about race, or what we believe about the Civil War, what we believe about slavery, is something we have learned. Education matters. Now, education is not to be confused with schooling. Schools are one thing. Education is something much, much bigger. Education occurs at every point of our everyday existence when we're children going forward. But if you can learn one thing, you can learn something else. Mm-hmm. And I believe that education and schooling can make a difference, and that gives me some reason to hope.
Beautifully put. And Woody, Dr. Register, thank you so much. And since you ended there, I will say God bless your work as an educator, and God bless our teachers and educators and professors throughout our country. May you continue to help us learn history and other subjects so that we might become more self-aware and perhaps even more hopeful. Thank you so, so much for your time, your thoughts. I've enjoyed being with you, and I know our people have, Woody.
Thank you for this opportunity to address parishioners. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us, everyone. And I will say just a very brief word. If you've enjoyed this forum, please do know that it's made possible by your pledges and financial gifts to the cathedral. And if you are considering making a financial pledge for next year, we'd be grateful. We need it. This is budget season, Woody. You're aware of what this is like. And one can make a gift or pledge to the cathedral at sjcathedral.org and click the Give tab, please. Our service of Holy Eucharist with spiritual communion begins in about 9 minutes, and you can view the service at our same homepage, sjcathedral.org. Take care. And again, Woody, thank you.
So long.